Willy Loman is a character that most people don't feel bad for, and in fact, most people reading about him feel kind of disgusted. I think that was true for my English class, and most people don't have this immediate sense of empathy for this supposed to be relatable character. I recently read Death of a Salesman by Arthur Miller, one of the mid-century American plays that depicts the northern industry and the American dream. When I was reading the play, I enjoyed the play. I think emotionally it was a really, really sad play. Out of the 5 plays I think I read, it made me feel in a lot of ways that were quite negative. I felt that it wasn't a sense of a love for the character and this connection of his story, but rather a sense of disgust and how I would never ever want to live this life and in this time. Willy Loman made me think of one character specifically, and I didn't really figure out who it was for a bit. As I got on through the plays, I knew exactly who he reminded me of and why. I almost felt a sense of relatability to Willy, which I couldn't quite say before. That character, in fact, is Michael Scott from The Office. I did a quick Google search and it was Michael Scott and Willy. I was hoping to see Loman pop up in the suggestion, but the only thing that popped up was Willy Wonka. So I guess no one really felt this way, except for this one Reddit thread. Thank you, Reddit, for always having everything. The Reddit thread also questions if Michael Scott was based on Willy Loman. Of course, we know The Office is based on the original British series. However, I think the American version has strayed a lot from the plots of the very short-lived British sitcom, so I think we can characterize it as its own show. Obviously, its own great and better show. So the one reply that came from this one thread with 5 upvotes, he says, David Brent is much more similar to Loman. Michael eventually comes to terms with who he is and grows as a person, while Brent and Loman both let their obsession consume them. Michael eventually comes to terms with who he is and grows. And I think this line really stood out to me, where the distinguishing factor of why people feel so differently about him, because honestly, my personal reaction to Michael is that I feel he feels like a relatable character that I can personally relate to, and I can feel a lot of those sad emotions he goes through alongside him. And I think these 2 characters, although having, honestly, I'll point out later, they have quite literally the exact same storyline as their careers as salesmen, but most people feel this sense of connection to Michael, that and this sense of empathy and positive emotions about Michael that people don't feel about Willy. And I think this one line of how Michael grows really is the answer here. In Death of a Salesman, Arthur Miller uses Willy Loman to explore and expose several issues of the time. Willy Loman is depicted as a stereotypical male chasing the American dream. Through the storyline of Willy, Miller reveals that the Northern success and definition of masculinity is ultimately achieved through its marketable identity. It is very clear that there are 2 things that are being sold in this play. The first is obviously the objects that these salesmen choose to sell, whether that's daily goods or beers, anything like that. The second thing that is being sold that is directly paralleled to what the salesmen sell, which are objects, is the salesmen themselves. And as shown, the salesman, with Willy being one of them, is a prime example of a northern industrial man of middle class status of the time. Through understanding the marketing and propaganda tactics that is used to sell these objects, it's clear with the comparison of how the salesmen themselves are alike the objects that they sell. An identifying characteristic of the mid-century America was the use of slogans to instill a collective drive for consumerism into a unified culture identity. In doing so, the use of these slogans within advertisement became a way to capture this gilded ideal of a concealed truth or product in this case. Thus, the ability to appeal to a wide range of consumers and embellishing any flaws within these products was the ultimate goal. Companies and salesmen will use various tactics to achieve this goal. As you can see here, Fresh Up with 7 Up is one of many, many slogans used to achieve consumer appeal. These slogans are catchy and short in grabbing their consumers' attention. When you buy these products, not only do you obtain, obviously, this product, but you obtain this ideal that they're selling you. In this case, you can see the happy family holding up their 7-Up each and living this beautiful life as a family together with their 7-Up. So when the consumers are buying the product, they're not just buying this 7-Up, but they're buying this ideal life they could live with the 7-Up. These catchy slogans are a prime example of how the mid-century salesman embellishes flaws and captures their product into one digestible slogan to sell to their audience. As a salesman, Willie uses these same sales tactics. Willie wishes to embody the ideals of an American self-made salesman who embellishes any product in constructing desire. To describe this goal, Willie expresses that a man during this period should be liked and you will never want. This simple phrase is quite important. Just like the slogan of the 7-Up, Willie expresses his life ideals through this one-liner, where all of the values that he embodied can essentially be rendered down to this one line. Directly reminiscent of the structure of this commercial slogan, Willie extends his dependency to adorn the truth as a result of his devotion to salesmanship into his own life beyond the products he sells, where Willie aspires to never want and emphasizes the power of being liked, and this demand overpowers any other intrinsic utilities of a man, such as the various other values that an individual can find within themselves to enjoy their life as well as their existence. None of this matters to Willie more than the goal of being liked, which is the exact same goal of a product, where it doesn't matter any value that a product has as long as it's being wanted and consumed and sold. So in this emphasis, Willie formulates his life into a single message where he exposes the direct parallels between the flaws of his life and the defects of a commercial product in the capitalist market. As a result, the ways he attempts to transform his own failures mirror the path a salesman would take to rebrand a defected product. And when I say a product is defected, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything wrong with the product physically, just that most products need to be embellished in advertisement in order to be sold. It is clear that Willie measures his self-worth in these economic terms, equating his assets to the world with market value, so he manufactures his desirability, insisting that I never have to wait in line to see a buyer. In this claim of him saying, I never have to wait in line to see a buyer, Willie manufactures his desirability. His desperate yearning to be demanded, such as a product, matches the theory of supply and demand that we can see in the market for objects. This parallel of the object that these salesmen sell and the salesmen themselves make a few claims about the mid-century American capitalism. In reducing himself to a mere commodity to be bought, Willie internalizes this capitalism, treating his humanity to be marketed, sold, and competitively priced rather than holding any inherent self-worth and values. From this interpretation of Willie, a northern man in this post-war capitalist America, his identity is proven vulnerable as it coincides with the unstable nature of the capitalist success of the time. Just as a product's value fluctuates with its demand, Willie's masculinity also serves very volatile. Thus, the northern sense of masculinity is built upon the utilities of a man define their ability to market themselves and also the results of marketing themselves, which is their desirability. Both as salesmen, there are a lot of similarities between Michael Scott and Willy Loman. We can start with their deep-rooted sense of self-consciousness and the obsession with being liked by others.
Do I need to be liked? Absolutely not. I like to be liked. I enjoy being liked. I have to be liked, but it's not like this compulsive need to be liked, like my need to be praised.
As a boss, Michael constantly seeks this never-ending approval from his employees, treating them more like friends than his subordinates. Both Michael and Willie's sense of success comes from their profession. For Michael, it's less about the money, and similar to Willie, work becomes their whole identity. Salesmen don't make that much money, and they are in this profession to get social approval. They care about this love that they receive from the workplace, which is where they get their circle of friends, rather than the money itself. They're both very lonely people outside of their work, and this is very clear for Michael as we see his day-to-day interactions within and out of the office. And this is pretty clear for Willie, as the approval that matters the most is validation of being a salesman from other people in his line of profession. Michael keeps turning Dunder Mifflin into family, and Willie feels worthless without the ability to sell. Outside of this deep desire to be liked, they both imagine things. Willie fakes his sales productivity, claiming that he is a famous salesman in New England, and Michael imagines and creates this narrative that he's a great boss. We can see this from several initiatives that he creates in the workplace, such as the Dundies or Diversity Day. They're ultimately both initiatives that Michael takes in creating this narrative for himself that he's a great boss, even if this sense of great workplace environment isn't reciprocated and felt with his employees. We can see how Diversity Day and other events that Michael creates to fill his own sense of belonging is not felt with his employees. Although the sitcom has these strange tactics used by Michael to show a sense of humor, it ultimately reflects a disconnect between what Michael feels and what his employee feels. This same disconnect is clear for Willie, as he himself experiences the narrative that he is a well-known and respected salesman, while other people can see very clearly through his lies that he constructs. Earlier, when he loses this ability to generate likability and thus usefulness for his family and himself. We can see this when his boss, Howard, fires him, buyers stop calling him, his network that used to exist kind of disappears, and then his popularity slowly diminishes over time. This again ties back to the idea of how his desirability and popularity is ultimately temporary, and the people that he once could consider friends that generated him this desirability were fake. They were temporary, alike to the temporary value that an object holds in a capitalist market. His value as a person is directly linked to this productivity. And this is what the system tells him, completely rejecting him when he loses these ideal values that a middle class man should hold. The system only accepted one specific model of a man and husband and salesman, and when he didn't fit this type model, he was rejected. If you can no longer sell yourself, if you can no longer sell, you no longer matter. However, we can see as the show progresses, Michael Scott faces a very different reality. People embrace Michael, and he gains true friendship. It's true. Of course, Michael is the same awkward, sometimes incompetent, very immature, and oftentimes a very unfair guy. His employees grow to love him and genuinely care for him. Of course, the clear example is, I think, the scene where Michael came back at, I forgot which season it was, but I think that scene where he came back made me feel a lot of happy tears, and it was a really great scene. So by the end of The Office, Michael receives a lot of true emotional fulfillment rather than economic success, which is what he chases. We see Michael actually being able to make social connections for himself, such as when he shows up for Pam's art show and really gains authentic value that he wanted to generate for himself. So despite Michael's flaws and unique personality, the system tells him that he's still, even if he isn't this exceptional model of a boss, of a salesman, of a husband, which he's not the ideal definition for either of those roles, clearly. So what exactly is it that Michael not fitting in the ideal model and the role of a boss and a salesman allows him to achieve this genuine social likability, and Willie Loman isn't? And what does this reveal about the capitalist world that they both live in? I think this clearly points out this changing exception to fitting in, where capitalism now rewards relatability beyond just being this perfect model of an American dream man. In the society that Willie lived in, success meant that you had to fit the single models. So he spends effort trying to fit that model. So individuals spend efforts in order to fit that model. You are attractive, you're the man of the house, you have this nuclear family as a wife, and you sell your utility. And clearly, Willie does not fit this model in the play. Society and capitalism slowly begins to exclude Willie. So he's slowly pushed out, meaning that maybe he stops consuming. Many years later, in the world that Michael lives in, success meant selling yourself rather than this ideal that you believe you have to fit in order to be able to be sold. Now, being quirky is profitable, being unique, being relatable is profitable, as we can see in Michael's case. The current rise of social media is a good example of this phenomenon where a lot of influencers, despite kind of all fitting into this mold, believe that they're unique and actually thrive off of this idea of being unique and different in order to generate value. So people sell a lot of personalities still, again, they are similar, but now it is considered mainstream to be unique. Michael's awkwardness, offensiveness becomes this mainstream and he's accepted into this world. So what does Michael's acceptance ultimately mean? It is pretty clear that capitalism did not start valuing authenticity because it became more accepting. It just means that authenticity became valued because it was marketable, and now authenticity and the ability to be unique is what's marketable. So anything can now be of value and become a product and make profit, but to also anything can consume and fall victim to what Willie Loman fell victim to. Your humor, identity, personality can all be marketed, bought, and sold. This system no longer rejects being unique, but it turns these natural, innate personalities that individuals hold for profit. Thus, everyone can now be marketable, even if you didn't fit the traditional mold. In social media, these become forced and still judged on their economic value. So we have Michael Scott to thank for this analysis. The acceptance of Michael Scott's humor is no longer comedic. Society no longer asks people to sell their labor, but to sell themselves. The greatest transformation and achievement of modern capitalism was convincing people that self-expression and the ability to be unique is freedom when it renders down to another form of exploitation. So the acceptance of these perceived ability of personal freedom succeeds because it is transformed into a marketable asset. Willie sold his utilities that were of the traditional value to succeed. People like Michael sells themselves. In the end, The Office is a documentary show, a show within a show. It points that Michael is selling himself and his personality rather than his labor. Through this comparison, the greatest innovation achieved was turning perceived individuality into a commodity to be marketed and